This includes the Mill Valley Library Foundation and the Friends, who provide generous funding, library staff, who help plan the programs and do the heavy lifting. Quite literally, they move furniture to make this room set up for the event. And to you, the audience, especially you, the audience, for your enthusiastic support of what happens here. Finally, thank you to Stephanie Moulton-Peters. You want to stand up, Stephanie? She's over there. Stephanie is just starting her second term as mayor for the city of Mill Valley, and she has made the environment one of her priorities. She's also a regular at First Fridays and a fan of the library, so thank you, Stephanie. There's an arresting passage in Philip Larkin's Whitsun Weddings, in which the poem speaker, sitting in a railway carriage as it rolls away from a station somewhere in northern England, observes the expressions of those lingering behind on the platform, the families and friends of his fellow passengers. He notes that, as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Climate change presents a similar dichotomy. Among scientists for whom contentious debate is central to the very discipline, we are now witnessing the most uniform consensus since Newton's laws of celestial motion. Here on the ground, that consensus is fragmented by politics, by special interest, by ethnic chauvinism, by the inertia of market forces, and by a prevailing culture of denial. Even many of those who accept the reality of climate change continue to apportion blame and responsibility, which is not the same thing as doing something about it. So that train too is leaving the station, and we, stuck fast on the platform, are watching it roll away, seeing what we want to see, making of it what our limited personal viewpoints allow. Antwi Akom brings a powerful, compelling voice to the subject of global climate change and to those socioeconomic realities which, if unacknowledged and unaddressed, will continue to fuel its present momentum. Our survival as a species depends on the inclusion and participation of what is now a vast, disenfranchised, marginalized population. Their industry and creativity, their genius, as Dr. Akom puts it, are critical to the reversal of a fast approaching calamity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Antwi Akom.
Thank you. Greetings, Mill Valley. To me, I was very impressed with this kind of a turnout on a Friday, on a cold Friday evening. So thank you for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Angie and all the Mill Valley staff for having me. I am grateful, so thank you. So what you're going to hear from me tonight is sort of the combination of about 20 years of my own work on Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist practice, critical pedagogy, environmental sociology, and environmental science. And so you're going to sort of hear me fuse these really different, and oftentimes folks think of them as disparate fields, and talk about how what we're doing to help build a climate justice movement for everyone. Right? Not just for some people, but a climate justice movement for everyone. So the title of the talk is Eco-Buddhism and Mindfulness, Building a Climate Justice Movement. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of my racial toxins framework. We're going to start with a key theoretical concept, and it's fascinating and sort of sad, and I guess I should pay some tribute to Nelson Mandela, right, and his whole struggle, but I'm going to talk about eco-apartheid and sort of how that's impacting all of us in different ways. We're going to map eco-apartheid and really take a look at what it looks like. And then, so the first part of this conversation with all of you is going to be about what I see as the problems, right, that are impacting all of us. And then the second part is going to be about solutions, right, what we can do to really transform the social and material conditions in our communities. And we're going to address this question of how can engage Buddhism, because all Buddhisms are not the same, right? So how can engage Buddhism, which is relatively new, right, and mindfulness help us build a more powerful climate justice movement? The key questions that I'm going to address for all of you today are, how does racism penetrate the body, get underneath the skin, and impact health and educational outcomes? Right? In other words, what does racism look like in the 21st century? Right? We know it doesn't look like it did in the 20th century. What does it look like in the 20th century, 21st century? How is it impacting us? Right? How can technology be used in ways to grow our capacity for empathy and deepen our interconnection and intervene? Right? And whenever I talk about this amongst practicing Buddhists, they're looking at me like I'm crazy, because they're saying technology is the problem. Right? And in some ways it really is, and we know that. But we're going to talk about how can technology be part of the solution. Right? How is individual awakening crucial to societal transformation? And then we're going to introduce a tool that we developed, a GIS mapping tool used through cell phones, and we're going to talk about how we're using that to transform the climate justice movement on a global level. So my point of departure for everyone is the problem, to me, of the 21st century is the problem of climate justice and corporate greed. Right? In particular, the ways in which the climate justice movement responds to growing issues of racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequality. Long before Hurricane Sandy, low-income communities from West Harlem to East Los Angeles, from the Cancer Alley that runs from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, all the way to New Orleans, or from the Toxic Triangle where I do my own work. The Toxic Triangle runs from Richmond, California, all the way down through Berkeley into Oakland and across to San Francisco Bay View Hunters Point. Right? Long before Hurricane Sandy, low-income communities and communities of color, we knew that there was a health-wealth gap. Right? We knew that there were eco-haves and eco-have-nots. Right? We knew that race and class played a role in terms of who gets left behind with respect to housing, healthcare, education, and so on. But what these hurricanes or natural disasters have really done, right, is they blew the lid off of environmental racism, right, and the color-coded ways in which our government often responds to some of our nation's most vulnerable populations. And I start there because even though to me the problem of the 21st century is climate justice, there is a second climate crisis growing alongside the first, with equally devastating effects and similar social origins. Right? It is a crisis of our human imagination. Right? It's a crisis of our human mobilization. It's a crisis of human intervention, and it is the collapse of our educational system. So we have two climate crises happening at the same time, both with devastating consequences for the future of the planet. We have the collapse of our ecological systems, and we have the collapse of our educational systems. But there's not enough people talking about the relationship between the two, right? There's not enough people talking about how does the environment impact our schools and our school systems. and school children, right? But we've got lead in the paint, arsenic in the water, PCBs in the windows, asbestos in the ceilings and in the floors, right? We're at a point where many of our schools are so dysfunctional and toxic that I call them, they're building and creating toxic toddlers, right? The very school lunches that we're feeding our children are causing what Jonathan Coleswell refers to as death at an early age, right? And I call all of these things eco-apartheid. Because it's not just happening in our schools, it's happening in our communities, and there are racial, gender, and socioeconomic components. So what is eco-apartheid? This is from an article I recently wrote out of Columbia University in the Teachers College Record. Eco-apartheid is a systems theory that examines the ecological impacts of structural racialization. It highlights the ways that structures and institutions cumulatively produce unequal environmental health, outcomes, and other benefits and burdens based on race, class, gender, immigration status, etc. So, what does that mean? What do I mean by eco-apartheid? Well, I'll give you an example. So, go into your eco-imagination and imagine all of you are dark-skinned, nice and chocolatey like me. Right, so you're all dark-skinned students and you're all living in West Oakland, okay? So, how many grocery stores are in your community in West Oakland? Just throw something out. This is the interactive part. 7-Eleven, a half? A half, that's close. That's close. But give me some numbers. Are there 10? West Oakland. 3, 4, 5, 6, 2? Right, so depending on how you draw the boundaries of West Oakland, right, there's basically one grocery store, right, in your community, serving all of you, okay? Now, how many liquor stores are in your community? 30. 70, right? So depending on how we draw the boundaries of your community, right, in West Oakland, there's close to 70 liquor stores in your community, okay? So, you all are little black and brown children and you're hungry and you're on your way to school. Where are you going to stop and go to get some food? Liquor store. What kind of food are you going to eat? Chips, right? Takis, jerkies, right? M&M's, right? Come on, tell the truth. The Kit Kat, the Snickers. I mean, come on, you know what you eat now. Cheetos, right? Right? Don't hide, right? Right? Exactly. So, remember, we're talking about eco-apartheid and we're talking about cumulative causation. We're talking about what do I mean by this term, right? And so you're on your way to school, you're living in West Oakland, you stop at the liquor store, you load up on all that sugary products. Now, what is the race and the gender of most people teaching in urban schools? Most of the teachers. White women. Right? And this is not to say that white women cannot teach students of color, because they absolutely can. I'm not saying that. I'm just noting that's who that's who your teacher is most likely going to be. Right? So, when you all go into that classroom and you sit down and you're all sugared up, what is the general diagnosis for all of you black and brown children? There you go. Right? You said it, I didn't. I didn't have to say it. Right? So that's eco-apartheid, right? That's cumulative causation, right? That these structural components are impacting how you perform in school, how you're labeled in school, how you're seen in school, right? So that in an eco-apartheid analysis, the outcomes matter more than the intent, right? Everybody could wish well for all of you in West Oakland. We're all well, good-meaning people, but you're getting screwed over because of your food system, right? Because of where you live. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So why is this important? Who cares about eco-apartheid? The significance of eco-apartheid is threefold. First, it suggests that environmental bads, like toxic waste, are in communities of color, while environmental goods, such as whole foods, open space, parks, etc., are in wealthier neighborhoods. Is that true for Mill Valley? It's absolutely true, right? Eco-apartheid is a more powerful definition than environmental racism, precisely because it captures inequalities beyond race, right? Including space, place, and waste. For example, the urban grocery gap, the transportation gap, right? The fresh produce gap, while simultaneously centering race and racism and the political implications. And then finally, eco-apartheid captures the political, the historical, and the spatial dimensions to the reproduction of racial and gender inequality. And this comes straight from Tim Walz, right? And that is, the history of the United States is the history of systematic, institutionalized racial privilege for white people and white-looking people, right? So all the white people can exhale. You don't have to feel guilty at all here, right? But that's our history as a country, right? The history of our country is the history of systematic institutionalized racial privilege for white people and white-looking people. So when you see folks of color trying to quote-unquote pass and look like they're white, right? When you see that happening, it is not because they didn't love who they were necessarily. It is because they wanted access to institutionalized resources and privileges that they otherwise wouldn't have, right? So this is true, whether we are talking about the Naturalization Act of 1790, the first law passed after the Constitution was ratified, which said that whites and whites only could be free citizens of the United States. Or whether we're talking about the Homestead Act of 1860, right, which guaranteed white folks 160 acres of land for $10, right? People of color couldn't get 40 acres in a mule, fair. Or whether we're talking about federally subsidized FHA and VHA loans, right? On the backs of those loans was the creation of the white middle class. And if we would have done the same thing for people of color, right, we call it welfare. And when we did it for white folks, you know what we called it? Good, sound economic policy, right? That's just real talk, right? And we know all this in terms of wealth, right? We know what this means. In terms of wealth, what it means is the average white family has 22 times more net worth than the average black family, 20 times the average net worth than the average Latino family, right? Not solely because of hard work, not solely because of better values, right? But because of systematic, institutionalized racial privilege passed from one generation to the next, right? My grandmother couldn't even buy a house. Now, to show you how we all work together and what this means is she had to ask a white person who was gracious enough to help her, right, to buy a house. But that's within living memory. We're talking about something very distant, right? So we know all this for wealth, right? But what does this mean for health? What does this mean for schools, right? What does this mean when we talk about healthy schools and sick schools, winner regions and loser regions? So what does eco-apartheid look like in the Bay Area? So this is a map of a toxic release inventory facility, right? Those are basically smokestacks. The red dots are basically where the smokestacks are, and the gray areas are where people of color live, right? So that folks of color black folks are 3 times more likely to live next to a smokestack, right? Latinos 2 times more likely, Asian Americans 1.5 times more likely. And this is a picture that many of you might be familiar with. August 6, 2012, Richmond, California. Right? And a great activity that I suggest all of you do with students, teachers, family, friends is I have folks shut their eyes, and I'm going to have you do it. Shut your eyes, please shut your eyes. Right? And imagine a crime is taking place. Okay. Open your eyes. And when you debrief this particular activity, you ask folks, what did you see? Right? There's too many people here and we don't have time. Right? But basically, most people see a man committing the crime, not a woman. Right? Oftentimes, it's a person of color, but not always.
right? And we hardly ever see this. The real criminals, right? We're not looking at the corporatocracy, the greed, right? That's really the major criminals that are siphoning, killing people and siphoning resources out of our communities, right? And so what is this doing? The questions we're asking is, what is this doing to the food systems? When you have, that was Richmond, California, right? That was Chevron spewing all of that toxic waste all over these community gardens. Right? What is that doing to the soil? Right? What is that doing to the food that people are growing and that people are eating, right? And this is the answer. So if you haven't seen the movie Unnatural Causes, I suggest everybody watches it. It's a PBS movie called Unnatural Causes. But basically, they address this question of why are black and brown youth dying of unnatural causes, right? And on this side, you see what a healthy vein looks like, okay? And on this side, you see what a vein looks like in a black or brown person when they're stressed out. And as we know, cortisol increases your stress hormones and clogs your arteries. So the medical research is absolutely clear, right? That there's this weathering effect and there's these negative physiological impacts of living in a race-conscious society. Right? And I always sort of make fun that, doesn't this side look like a symbol of Africa? Right? I just got that off the internet. But the reality is it's true, right? It's Africans and black folks that are most impacted and stressed out and that are dying of diabetes, heart attacks, all of these things that we don't necessarily associate with you all growing up in that environment in West Oakland. You're going to hear me talk more about this theme. This also impacts the life expectancy gap. I happen to live in the Berkeley Hills. If you live in Berkeley, you're going to live 10.9 years longer than if you live in the Oakland Flatlands, right? So my point to all of you is that we have not correctly identified the problem, right? We do not have an achievement gap, right? An achievement gap implies inequalities based on culture or genetic difference. What we have, and the term that all of you should be using moving forward, is an opportunity gap, right? An opportunity gap remaps inequalities onto existing structural conditions, okay? So what can be done? What are some of the solutions that we can be working on to solve these problems that I just talked about? So for the past 20 years, as I said, I've been working on, how do we create more just, sustainable, and smarter cities? How do we create more democratic and spiritual models of civic engagement? And how do we create not just bodhisattvas, right, which are enlightened beings, right, but eco-sattvas, right, that combine self-transformation with devotion to social and ecological transformation. So for 20 years, we've been building these tools that I'm about to show you that are helping cities and schools become smarter, tools for communities to innovate and connect and work together, communities to craft new political and social realities, community members to enlarge in their capacity for interbeing, and heal and recovery a sense of sacredness. Now, why am I starting with cities? Because the problem is, by the year 2030, as everyone knows, urbanism is happening. Right? By the year 2030, we're going to have 60% of the world's population will be living in cities. By 2050, 70%. So we're looking at this environment where everyone is going to be living on top of one another. We're all going to be much closer than we were before. We have been teaching young people about the eco-imagination and Eco-Buddhism to transform these social material realities. We've been teaching young people mindfulness, right, and using mindfulness in schools to transform their culture, using mindfulness bells to help young people calm down and not get into arguments and sort of reflect on who they are and how they interact, right? And what we've seen is the dropout rates have gone down, right? We've seen academic improvement increase because of using these types of tools in schools. So, Karen Armstrong and Henry Luis referred to this as compassionate sustainability. And we've combined compassionate sustainability with cutting-edge technologies in order to create more shareable cities. And when we talk about shareable cities, we're talking about the bike share movement, right? Are you familiar with that? The car share movement, right? So there's these huge movements to create more sharing in cities that aren't necessarily grounded in spirituality, but can be thought of when you think of Buddhism to be moving towards the larger moral principles of love, understanding, compassion, and sharing, right? However, as I started off, we currently don't have shareable cities, right? And we need to have more shareable cities. This is a picture of one of my students, Shanice, and this is an example of how we don't yet have shareable cities. What Shanice is holding in her hand is an acceptance letter to San Francisco State University. Shanice would have been the first child in her family to attend a four-year university. We had set up a whole network of college and career pathways for Shanice with folks and professors at Stanford University, Berkeley, Harvard, Columbia, so on. However, Shanice was shot and murdered, right, outside, sitting in her car, doing nothing but just enjoying her evening, right? And every year that I've been teaching, I have experienced one of my students be murdered or killed. Now, even in fact, on the first day of school this year, because I'm a college professor who also teaches, I teach high school students and they get college credit. So it's an early college model, kind of like AP, but I do it for students who are really marginalized and disconnected because they often don't have AP classes in the schools that you all attend in West Oakland, right? Berkeley High has 18 to 20 AP classes. McClymonds in West Oakland offers 2, right? Every year, this year, the first day of school, gunshots rang out, right? And the students' gun violence was so normalized that young people didn't even respond. They responded to it almost, they knew what to do in terms of having a lockdown, as well as many folks know the Pledge of Allegiance, right? That's the kind of environment that we're looking at. But I think even more shocking is the smokestacks that I showed you and what the media covers, right? Because more people are actually dying of asthma from those smokestacks, from the diabetes, from the Eco-apartheid, than even from the gun violence. But what did students like Shanice do wrong? Right? They did nothing wrong except they were born in the wrong zip code. They're forced to grow up in the wrong zip code. So there are 3.9 million children who grow up in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. That's 2.5 times the entire population of Manhattan. And worldwide in wealthy countries, there's 30 million youth who grow up in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And I want to be really crystal clear on what I'm saying here. This means no matter how hard those young people try, no matter how hard their parents work to get ahead, right? The single greatest determinant of their life chances, of their command over resources, is the neighborhood that they grow up in, right? Is the zip code. So this is a crisis. It's a moral crisis because I should never be able to tell you, which I absolutely can right now, before the school year even starts, how many kids are going to fail, how many kids are going to pass, what is their race, what is their gender, right? What is the class before school year even starts? I should not be able to do that. But it's a financial crisis because we are spending $63 billion on downstream costs like building the prison industrial complex, right? And when you add in healthcare, this is all of us. When you add in healthcare, we're talking about trillions of dollars, right? Instead of upstream costs like building sustainable cities and schools, right? So Van Jones asked this really powerful question. You know, what if we built a movement at the intersection of social justice and ecology movements, of entrepreneurship and activism, of interchange and social change? Right? What if we didn't just have a hybrid cars? What if we had a hybrid movement? And so that's what we've been trying to build at IC, the institution that I founded just 2 years ago. We're only 2 years old. Okay? Why do we start with technology? Well, we asked, what is the one thing that young people carry across culture, gender, and context? right? Right. Money and cell phones, right? Those are the two things that young people are always carrying, right? So in 2001, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but in the Philippines, there's 85 million people in the Philippines. 2 million internet users, 3 million landlines, 30 million cell phones. Okay? The president Estrada was forced out in 2001 when 1 million people texted, right? In which they call a coup de text, right? So that's what they call it. That's what they call it. And so we have tried to figure out how do you harness that technology and use it for urban populations, right? So in combination with UC Berkeley, we developed this mapping tool that I'm about to show you. And basically it allows you to map the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in a particular community, right? And share the best practices for climate justice around the world. We're calling it, and we've been planning, what we call CYBER, which is the Climate Justice Youth Bill of Environmental Rights. We're planning the largest day of climate action in history. I don't know if many of you are familiar with who Bill McKibben and 350 are. Right, so we've spoken with Bill many times about this, and I really admire the work of 350, and they are a part of this. However, 350 has done an amazing job, but they're doing one-and-done movements, right? One-and-done social actions. So the conversation has been, how can we do something that is much more sustainable, right? And so what we've been planning is a climate justice bill of rights that allows young people and adults to work together. So part of the power of ground truthing is, you can't see anything, but this is an indigenous community over South America, right? And an oil company, Chevron, wanted to actually, like Chevron, wanted to actually do some drilling in this particular community, okay? But when you ground truth that community with the power of the mapping tools, what you see is these are all of the community assets in that community. Right? And knowing the assets helped reverse the corporation, in this particular case, from drilling in that particular community. So we're doing something similar, and this is a picture of East Oakland. So what you see here is a public data set coming from the Alameda County Department of Public Health. And these purple dots are the number of quote-unquote grocery stores in this particular community. So if you looked at this community, you would think that it looks like a virtual food oasis, right? However, when you ground truth this community, instead of all of those quote-unquote grocery stores, what you found is there's only one grocery store, right? And all those others were liquor stores, as we talked about earlier, right? And so with the mayor here, the question is, what does that mean for planning, right? What does that mean with this information? What does that mean for planning? What does that mean for policy? What does that mean for service delivery when you have this kind of information, right? Another really innovative feature of this tool is digital storytelling. And we're going to play for you what the young students themselves had to say about the liquor stores in their community.
Okay, so what are you, let's see, what are you looking at? How was it when you went inside?
It was dirty when I went inside, and I would never eat anything in there.
Do you consider this to be a grocery store?
Hell no. Because they don't sell any groceries, and it's just a bunch of junk food in there. And I mean, they have little sandwiches, but I would never eat that because it's dirty. And then all the fruit is all like wrinkly and looks old. And then all the meat that they did have, like the bacon and all that in the little thing, looks like it's been sitting in there for about a year or something like that. I wouldn't call it a grocery store at all. So, hell no, I wouldn't eat there.
So part of this tool that young people are helping us develop is, and people have been giggling around this, but listen, 91% of all Americans use cell phones, right? The penetration of cell phones is extremely high in this country. So we've created this cyber youth activism where young people, the red pins can actually designate the problems in their community, right? That is, I live next to a smokestack facility. The yellow pins represent the actual consequences of that, which is asthma in this case. And the green pins actually represent a solution, so that you can automatically have a pre-formatted text that goes to your mayor, your governor, your principal, etc. And so the point is, we want to create people that are much more engaged and advocates and activists in their community. So our success, as a result of cyber, we've received over the past 4 years over $1 million in terms of funding. It's been a very successful project, and young people are placed at the center of community-based learning. They've moved from the epicenter, from the margins to the epicenter of the climate justice struggle, and they get an opportunity to voice what's right in their communities, right, rather than what's wrong in their communities. Our larger vision is, why can't we have schools, and we're actually now raising funds to build a school like this in East Oakland, that have vertical walls of plants that filter air and help reduce the carbon footprint, right? Solar panels that help reduce greenhouse emissions, and the young people actually get paid for putting the solar panels on the roof, right? Eco roofs that help reduce heat loss and absorb rainwater, greenhouses, edible gardens, many of the things you all probably already have here in this community. Do you have a school like this? Not yet. So we could use that. Wraparound support services, embedded health clinics, right, dental clinics, and racial justice and social equity running throughout the curriculum, right? When we have focused on the things that I just shared with you, with the young people, what we have seen when we focus on these human measures of racial awareness, racial identity, critical awareness, mindfulness, purpose, and hope, what we've seen is achievement scores go up and through the roof in terms of writing grades, college preparation, and college going. These are some of our students presenting our first Youth Bill of Rights. This is in Washington, D.C., with the Congressional and Hispanic Black Caucus, right? And that was really powerful. Another piece, we take young people all around the country to present their vision of what's going on in their community and how they have contributed to making powerful solutions in their community. And in conclusion, poor youth of color have been locked out of the pollution-based economy. The goal of cyber is to inspire and train the next generation of climate scientists and energy innovators from low-income communities and communities of color. I know I've said a lot, but our goal is really not to change the world per se, but first start with changing yourself, right? And so we want to encourage people and our young people to be visionary, to be entrepreneurial, to be technologically innovative, to be community committed, right? Climate activists. And at the heart of our work is the belief that education can change the world and is the greatest antidote to poverty and racism. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Can you comment a little bit further about the role of mindfulness in this work?
Yeah. So there's been a really, some really amazing work done by an organization called Mindful Schools. And there's been some really amazing work done by John Kabat-Zinn and others. However, a lot of that work has not really been penetrated into Black and Latino schools, right? And even the way that it's rolled out is not really culturally responsive to either low-income communities or Black and brown youth. And so what we've done is sort of taken the principles from those schools and sort of customized it and delivered it to new populations. And the idea is, how can you take young people growing up in the communities that I grew up in and also I work in are experiencing an unbelievable amount of trauma. Right? And the idea of mindfulness is a way to negotiate, navigate that kind of trauma and ultimately heal that kind of trauma. Right? But these young people are not being exposed to mindfulness. So that's how we've used it. Right? We're basically taking those concepts and bringing them into urban communities that haven't been exposed to those concepts before, and making it relevant to the young people's everyday lives and their everyday history, and their past history. So thank you for that question. Yes, ma'am. We'll just work our way back. You're first, yeah.
Well, my question is kind of a little bit provocative, and I don't mean, it may sound one way, so we'll give it a shot. But my understanding, so in that scene that you showed us of Chevron, and when you said, you know, they're the criminals, right? But I'm a little confused because in my understanding of Buddhism, you don't really, it's not about making enemies. We're all, as far as I understand it, we're all using the gas that Chevron's, you know, blowing out the haystack. So it's not like we're the criminals. We're all in this together. So I guess part of what I'm feeling right now is a little bit of this divisiveness that is antithetical to Buddhism, for me, personally. So,
Yeah, I think that's,
can you repeat the question? It's not really a question.
it's a statement. I think I'll try to summarize your comment, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me. Right. So her comment is basically when I call out Chevron, right, as criminals, that felt divisive. And in Buddhism, she's saying, we're all in this together. So she's saying on tweet, that seemed divisive to me. And I think that's powerful and interesting, what you're saying. I think my understanding of engaged Buddhism is ultimately about satyagraha, right, or the truth force, right? And the truth force, there's nothing wrong with saying the truth about someone or an institution. That does not mean that I don't have compassion for them. It does not mean that I don't have love for them. It does not mean that I don't have understanding for them. But I can comment from my place in Buddhism, right, on exploitation, right? And it's actually important, because if we don't do that, then the duality, right, the separation of ourselves from Pachamama, right, from the world, becomes even greater. And that's not what we want in Buddhism, right? We want to get to a place where we are not constantly living in a dualistic framework. We want to get to non-dualism. We want to get to interconnectedness. We want to get to inner being. But that comes from totally being honest with ourselves, which is why I spent a lot of time today being honest about sort of the larger context, because I actually think it helps us become closer, right? When we can be honest with ourselves about what we're doing and what we've done. And yes, we are all criminals in that sense, right? We're all angels in that sense, right? We have all of those things in us, the Buddha nature in us. Right? So that's my understanding, that's my response, that it's really important to sort of break through that dualism. It's really important to be honest and to use satyagraha. There was a question right here. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, following up on mindfulness, how, say a student comes in that's been traumatized by a horrible shooting event, how do you use that working with the student? I mean, what is mindfulness and how does it apply to the student?
Mindfulness is a lot of different things, but mindfulness is really about critical awareness, right, of yourself and your surroundings. Right, that's basically what it is. And I think that's one of the problems that's happening in urban schools, is that that is exactly what happened. The young student just lost their sister or their brother, and you're teaching them something that has no relevance to their everyday life. Right? And the teacher is not being mindful of the situation, as mindful as they could be. The curriculum is not being as responsive as it could be to the situation. So what we've done, piggybacking off of his question, is to try to take those situations, right, and make the curriculum relevant to the students' everyday lives, and to take time out, because everyone in here is very busy. And the young people are also very busy, right? And so oftentimes, a lot of young people, especially with the way technology is going, take very little time to reflect on themselves. They take very little time to go inside of themselves to figure out what are the motivations for my behavior, right? What are the root causes? Right? And even less time reflecting on why am I suffering and how is that suffering impacting my behavior. And so when we do mindfulness in schools, many of those questions we're addressing with young people, and they haven't even had the opportunity to check in with themselves in that way before. So it's actually been very powerful in terms of a tool of reflection and changing their response, right, to a very similar situation. So that's how we've been using it. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback into these two individuals' questions about mindfulness. My big understanding of it, mindfulness, a huge part of it is allowing thoughts to enter, right, and not to have any kind of moral association with them, that you're good or bad. You're not supposed to identify with them. Am I wrong in saying that?
You're not wrong.
It's such a Buddhist, right?
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. I mean, to me, what you're describing is meditation, right? And I think there's a relationship between meditation and mindfulness as those thoughts flow through, sort of like clouds passing by, and you're not making a judgment, right? And so I think that, I meditate every day, and I think that happens every day. But I think being mindful in every moment is very challenging in the way that you're describing it. It's an aspiration, but it's very challenging. But what's your question?
My question now is, as in this community, sometimes we might feel so far removed from some of the situations that you show us. What could we possibly do to be more proactive or to be more mindful to some of the youth situations?
Yeah, that's great.
Can you repeat the question or summarize it?
Sure. This community is very removed from many of the examples that I gave up here today. And so the young man's question was, what can we do? Right? And it was almost the perfect question. I promise I didn't plant him there. But, it's so perfect because that's how I got involved with climate justice. Right? Is the fact that what's happening, let's go to a larger metaphor of America. Right? When America we dump our toxic waste in less developed countries. Right? And we think that we're getting rid of it, right? Which is back to the whole separation of ourselves from the earth, right? We think that, if we put this waste here and we sort of cover it up, it's not going to impact us. But where is that wind blowing? Right? It's blowing to us, right? And so when the Chevron smokestack goes up and does what it does, it's also impacting us, right? And so that's part of the point, is that we are all very deeply interconnected, right? And part of this whole idea that that's not impacting us is a delusion. And that's really important in Buddhism, to recognize that we are deluding ourselves often, thinking that this has nothing to do with us, when actually it has everything to do with us, right? Thinking that there's no connection between the two. So the first thing is to be more mindful, which is to be more awake, to understand that there is a connection between the two. I mean, that's sort of the very first thing, to stop deluding ourselves into thinking that's happening over there and it's not impacting this community, right? And that's a very significant challenge. But once we wake up to that, there's many different things we can do to support other communities that are nearby, and I'm sure there's many challenges in this community that need to be solved as well. So that's my short answer. Okay, we'll keep moving back, then we'll come here, then we'll come there. Yes, ma'am.
My
so in some ways, I think people that are isolated in an upscale, overprivileged environment are just suffering just as much in some ways as people who are in the less privileged.
Absolutely.
Through their ignorance.
And other ways. I mean, to me, one of the roots of suffering is craving, right? Do any of you all have cravings? I mean, you know, certainly people in affluent communities are suffering, right? And there's suffering on a number of different dimensions. So I'm
Well, there's less opportunity for mindfulness in some ways because you have endless distractions readily available to you. Activities of every nature. I live near the school and I've noticed that instead of having recess, children now have regimented physical education classes. So they don't get that time, as much time to sit there and figure out what it is to be a kid and reflect on the social dynamics of the relationships they have, or their interests or anything else, because they're constantly being engaged in activities.
okay. I see where you're coming from. I tend to not think of it as a suffering Olympics. I think we're all suffering.
And in the end, there is a suffering involved.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying we're all suffering.
Right.
We all need help. We all need healing. We all need love. We all need compassion.
Well, it needs to be a bridge of some sort.
That's the key. So, I promised these folks over here, and then I'll come back to you. Yes, ma'am. Is that ma'am? Yes, ma'am.
Summarize what they're saying
I will summarize what they're saying.
from,
You want me to summarize what she just said? She just basically said there needs to be a bridge between the folks who are suffering in low-income communities and the folks who are suffering in affluent communities. Yes, ma'am.
okay, from what I have experienced is that people in the social justice community who seem to have become very mindful of what's going on, but it's the next step that we stumble on and can't get beyond. In other words, how many grocery stores have you actually established as a result of your studies?
I think that's such a great question. We're working on that. And if you have some money to donate towards that cause, that would be great. But I mean, that's part of the challenge is really resources, right? And there's something called the California Fresh Fund that actually transforms liquor stores into grocery stores. And so that is the next step of our work, is actually to tap into this California Fresh Fund and transform liquor stores into grocery stores. We're also a part of, we have a project called the Urban Organic Food Revolution, which is all about permaculture and bringing community gardens to low-income communities. We're also in conversation with the school district about using vacant lots, right? So the next step is something, the actual action of transforming those social material conditions is something we deeply care about, and I really appreciate that question. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that nearly $1 million had come into funding efforts, and I wonder where that's coming from. Is it coming from a part of California or national, and what kinds of people and organizations are funding this effort?
We have been really blessed with mostly getting foundations to support our work thus far. A few individual donors, but we haven't really asked any individual donors either. So mostly foundations, some federal funding, and some contracts. Those are the main sources. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I do have a question. I'm reminded that, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. My question is, you said that you went from a rather coercive code to a somewhat nicer zip code, which makes you a very good role model for the people that you're working with. They can see that this is actually possible, if unlikely. What do you describe that to be? How do you manage this?
So in my personal life, or just, I'm still just need a little bit more clarity with the question.
Is it implication from what you said that most people who are born in lousy zip codes and grow up in lousy zip codes generally stay in lousy zip codes, die younger, suffer more, get toxic waste dumped on their houses, whatever. But that there's at least a possibility of a way out because you're an example.
Yeah.
What do you describe your ability to get out of that?
I think, great question, thank you. Oh, right, thank you. Okay, so the question was, what in my own life has allowed me to go from a poor zip code to becoming a middle-class professor, right? That makes a very decent salary, right? So his question was, how was I able to do that, right? And yeah, and be non-white, right? So my answer is, my mother is amazing, right? She's really probably the best Buddhist that I know, and she's not a Buddhist, right? But in terms of her practice, so I grew up in a single-parent, female-headed household. In terms of her hard work, her passion, her support, her commitment, her love, her understanding, right? All of those ingredients that you need to grow up and be a healthy, thriving, happy, joyful young person, right? She, I have to give her all of the credit, for me being able to navigate my own circumstances. Right?
I wish it was something that was more generalized. You can't help your mom.
Just an add-on to that, for example, Malcolm Gladwell, who says you need to look at the environment of the person. So other than your mama, who else? The educational system, because there's other good mothers in West Oakland.
Sure. So just to repeat, she was saying, she quoted Malcolm Gladwell, who talks about the environment of the person. Look, I think that there's ways to build. The reason I'm engaged in this work is because I don't think it's about my mom or charisma, right? So I just want to be clear about the question. Psychologists have this new term about grit. I don't know if you all are up on grit, but they want to say that grit, G-R-I-T, like grit, determination, right, is that thing that can take that person from one zip code to another, right? But I think that there are a number of different ingredients that can be systematically delivered, that can help achieve what I have achieved in a consistent and systematic way, right? And that's why we're engaging in this work. And I put them up there, right? So I think that mindfulness is one of them, right? I think that engaged Buddhism is one of them. But I think getting into schools, that's why they call it mindfulness, right? They don't even call it Buddhism because then you're getting into religion in schools, right? So I think that mindfulness is one. I think mentorship is another. I think a rigorous academic component is another. I think workforce and work-based internships and learning opportunities is another. I think that wraparound support services is another, and that's the school that I showed you that we're building. Right? So the idea is, how do you institutionalize this so that we can go to scale? So that it isn't just this one or two or a few people, so that you are totally transforming neighborhoods in the built environment. And our vision is, build sustainable cities and schools so people do not have to leave their communities in order to live, learn, work, and thrive, right?
There's no reason why people should have to move away. I shouldn't have to move to the Berkeley Hills in order to breathe fresh air. Right. So that's what we're trying to do, and I hope that better addresses your question.
Actually, it does, because it gives practical reasons
Yeah.
how people can get out of their current situation.
Yeah. I thank you for that question.
Wonderful about yours.
I'm coming. I love the questions. I'll stay here all night. Let me get my wine in a minute.
Analysis is very interesting. But I was curious as to how you see the black-white relationships in this country. You can speak very much about that. It seems to me that things have improved in a very glorious way.
Okay. So his question was, how do I see black-white relationships in the United States? And in his view, they are improving. I think they're improving too. Right? I think having a black president was very meaningful. Having a black-white president, right? It was very meaningful. And that gets into the complications of, right, how we racially classify folks. But, you know, for black folks, you know, I have daughters, and I never, until President Obama, it's not something that we really said, "Ooh, you can be president," right? You can do it, right? That will happen if you want to make it happen. So there was always sort of a cap or a limitation on, you know, how high you could go, right? In terms of politics. And so I think it's very meaningful. Many of us in here have done, and many may not have voted for Obama, but you know, I think it's very meaningful to have President Obama. I'm hoping Hillary wins. Again, I think engaged Buddhism, we need to be political, right? We need to be thinking about politics. Politics are connected to resources. Resources help you transform things for the better, right? And so I think that's going to be very empowering for women, and I'm very excited about that. I think that we still have a long way to go in terms of race relations in the United States. And part of why I gave the brief history was that in World War II, I just wanted to remind everyone that the United States had an incredible opportunity to get it right. Right? We had the GI Bill. We had all of these soldiers returning post-World War II. We had the GI Bill. We had a number of different initiatives, right, that could have allowed communities like Mill Valley to look very different, right? Had we not redlined in the 1940s and the 1950s, right? Had banks not made certain decisions, these are policy decisions, America, as we all know, is an amazing country, right? But it's only going to be amazing when we share, right? When we allow. Well, I could do it with my own voice. But when we allow everybody access to institutional resources and privileges. And so that's part of why I wanted to have a conversation about what would a more shareable city look like. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for your talk, because the mindfulness is amazing. You know, I was a garbage man in Hunts Point for many years. And I would see that on a first and 15, people would buy a lot of sugar, Fruit Loops and sugar stuff, and then after about 3 days, the garbage would be, you know, totally dried out. And I used to think, well, you know, the farm, the farmer's market would come in there, and you know, and people wouldn't, you know, they would rather choose the sugary stuff. But it really opened my eyes, because, I mean, when you're living in a war zone and you are under post-traumatic stress, you turn to those sugary alcohol kind of things. You don't, the argument is, oh, well, it's one personal choice goes out the window when you live in a survival war zone, the way Hunters Point, West Oakland, some of these places are, where a lot of people never visited, they're in denial about it. It's over there, Richmond's over there, smoke ain't blowing over here. So.
They don't think it is, but it is.
And I would just like to commend you, because I think the mindfulness piece,
Thank you.
in order to calm, deal with the post-traumatic stress war zone like atmosphere, is a good start in order to start the nutritional programs and everything else. But how do you see the community embracing places like Hunters Point, going down there like a wraparound scenario? Because I also worked in the eco field for many years, so the waste industry and the energy efficiency industry. A lot of that money from PG&E in order to uplift the community and train people for green jobs and like that Joe was doing was kind of pushed over to the big facilities like the city or Alameda County School District, which is just using the money to keep the doors open instead of training young people on these programs of uplift. So it's one of the survival even for them too.
So, to summarize his question, he's basically asking, how are communities like West Oakland and Bayview Hunters Point really responding to getting resources around green jobs and green training? And he also shared his experience in those communities, and so the kinds of food folks were eating in those communities. And he also talked about the disconnection between communities like this and those communities. I do want to say one thing, and I'm going to get to answer that briefly. Look, who has the higher incidence of breast cancer? Marin County, right? So why do we have that?
Wine.
Oh, wine and alcohol. You think it, stop the wine. It's not wine and alcohol.
But it's so good.
Yeah, it's not wine and alcohol. It's screening? You think it's just screening? Anyway, the point is that there's a relationship between what's happening elsewhere and what's happening here. So even though we think that we're here, we are very disconnected from what's happening elsewhere. It's fascinating the amount of breast cancer that's happening in this community, right? And it isn't wine and it isn't alcohol, so drink on. I'm gonna grab mine in a moment, right? But there are other reasons. And the uptake in Bayview Hunters Point and West Oakland, it's been really well received. The training programs have been amazingly received. There's something called the Empowerment Neighborhood Network in Bayview Hunters Point that the community is driving. And I think the major component of what we showed and the mapping that we showed is that there are tools that can be used here in Mill Valley, right? That allow the community to be in conversation with schools, the community to be in conversation with developers, with business folks, right? To build a more shareable, a more ecologically friendly, a more socially just community and city, right? So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, speakers list. How should we do the speakers list? I'm just doing it by eye. All right. So let's go front to back and then over here. Is that okay? Yes,
The mayor.
all right, the mayor. Well, just because you're the mayor, you don't get to come in front of me. Good. Go ahead. So the question was, is there any hope to get a supermarket or a Safeway into the communities that don't have it? Absolutely, right? It's been shocking to me, just as a business idea, from someone from this community who has resources, why aren't you building that supermarket? I mean, do the analysis. It's just sitting there right? And anyone, most people with a little bit of vision can probably already begin to see the spillover that's going to happen, right? From San Francisco continuing to become more wealthy, right? Folks are getting pushed out, and where are they going to go? They're going to come to Oakland, right? And Oakland is going to be like Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is becoming very wealthy, and people are going to continue to be pushed out and out further and further. So it's
that's sad, I'm not commending it, and I'm saying we have an opportunity to do something different. But I'm also saying it's surprising because there is a business opportunity there for somebody who's entrepreneurial. But there is somebody who's very social justice oriented called the People's Grocery in West Oakland that is building a grocery store. This is now a plug for them. They've had an online campaign. They raised $1 million, $2 million, $9 million or $2 million? $1 million or $2 million to build this grocery store in West Oakland. And so they're going to be the folks who are going to deliver food in that area. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
So we spoke, you talked about the problem, finding the problem, gave us some statistics and data.
Thank you.
And talked to some experts about mindfulness and all that. I'd like to know if we're doing anything on a concrete basis to get people, the kids, and the unemployed, people who have been marginalized through this economic crisis. What are we doing to get those engaged in community work projects and community active paying community, not volunteerism, but jobs to bring, if you bring the income to the individuals in the community, they can afford to put in a Whole Foods. But you're not going to put a Whole Foods in unless you have infrastructure. So what are we doing to engage and put these folks back to work? Especially the folks that may have been, through the prison system and things coming back into the community. How do we deal with that?
Well, again, I didn't plant this man, but no, we're doing a lot. I mean, we've built something called the East Bay Green Corridor. You can Google it or look it up. It's the mayors of 9 cities, ranging all the way from Richmond down to Hayward, including Berkeley and Oakland. It's the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. It's 58 businesses, all who have come together to create really innovative college and career pathways for young people, and in particular, we've been focusing on formerly incarcerated folks. So I think building these kinds of college and career pathways is answering and addressing your question. Okay, well, I'm going to do my best to answer your question. But that is an answer. It's a $30 million project. And so the question would really be how many jobs would be created, right? I don't know, how many jobs? What'd you say? How many? I mean, yeah, we've created a couple of thousand jobs through the college and career pathways that we've built with the East Bay Green Corridor. We've got young people interning at some of the best known universities in the country who would have never been on that track. We've got something called, we're building worker co-ops in Richmond that are all around solar energy, where the community actually owns the worker co-ops. These are some of the things that one nonprofit is doing, right? So those are some of the things that we're doing. I encourage you to visit our website, right, which is ISEED.org, I-S-E-E-E-D, there's 3 E's, the Institute for Sustainable Economic, Educational, and Environmental Design.org, and you can sort of check out all of our projects. We're also partnering with something called Eco-Districts, right, which is about to roll out jobs in environmental health and active living and active design in 6 cities across the United States. So there's a number of different initiatives concretely that we're doing. And then we teach every day in schools, in these communities. So that's what we're doing, right? I was sort of working my way back this way. So I think it's you.
If my memory serves me correct, about 4 years ago, there was an article in either the New York Times or the New Yorker about a cocktail held in the home of Glenn Bernstein.
Okay.
Maybe there are some other people here who might remember this. But it seems that a group of progressive people who were involved with the then civil rights movement got together talk about the black-white issue. It always seems to me more of a white problem than a black problem, but, and it showed a tremendous disconnect between the empathy and the passion that they had for people of color, and the fact they were also kind of blind what was going on in their community, and even some of the ways that they talked with each other at this cocktail party. I don't know if anybody remembers this article. It was quite the cause celeb when it came out.
So what's your question?
I'm embarrassed. Because I don't live in the valley. I live in the next town, called Madera. But I know that there are a couple of people of color in this community. I don't see one here. Maybe because the title of the talk seems much more about ecology and Buddhism and very little about our racial divide. And I want to apologize to them, because I think that they would have been here if they had a better understanding of what was going to go on tonight. And I really want to thank you for crossing the bridge.
I appreciate that. I'm happy to stay here. As I said, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the quality of questions and with the level of engagement. For those of you who want to go, I mean, please go. But if you're enjoying yourselves, I'm enjoying myself. This is what it's really all about. This is how you build community. You dialogue, you talk, you ask critical questions. So, I'm here. Was there another question on this side? Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, what are you doing to bring the youth voice into the halls where, in the boardroom, the city council chambers, and places like that, where a lot of these political economic decisions are made? I'll tell you, a couple of times here in Berlin, we are missing a lot of youth voice in those places here, right? Where you kind of expect to hear San Rafael, the one occasion where we had trying to convince the city council to pass a single-use bag ban every year, and the one thing that made the city council sit up and notice was youth from the canal. Young people came in and said, plastic bag litter is a scourge in our community, we want to do something. And there were 4 or 5 people that came in and said that, and you could see the city council sit up, and then it was turn to the city manager and say, we want you to get these cities together and help us.
That's great. That's great.
I don't know Valley's already passed that.
That's great.
So, the youth voice.
So her question was, what are we doing to elevate and amplify youth voice? And the answer is that the tool that we built was built to elevate and amplify youth voice. So, I'm sorry? Absolutely. Right, so the tool allows them to be there with data. Right, so data is how city councils move to action. Right, so it's one thing to just go there and be upset. It's another thing to go there and armed with data and a solution, and right? And so that's what the tool does, and it also allows data visualization of how folks are being differentially impacted. Right? So it's a tool that if you're interested in using, we're happy to use it in communities like this. Right? And we'd be happy to talk to you about how young people could use the tool. Right? But that's what we're doing. Yes, ma'am.
I've been astonished and outraged by corporate greed. It's just incomprehensible to me, particularly Chevron.
Yeah.
Which I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks keeping out of Fairfax and getting arrested at the Chevron demonstration years ago.
I love that.
Are you able to work at that level at all with the work that you're doing?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Can you give me an example of something inspiring?
I mean, when I mentioned 350.org, I mean, the whole idea is to build, the whole idea of cyber is to build a coalition of nonprofit organizations that will stand up to that kind of corporate group, right? Yeah, it's community building, but on a much more sort of strategic, systematic, intentional development. Because right now what you have is some powerful nonprofits, but again, they're like people, they're operating in isolation. They're doing their thing, right? And so they're not coming together enough. They are in some ways, but not in ways that we think that they could, in more intentional ways to stop things like that. So that's what we're trying to build. We're building it, so we can't talk about the victories we've had yet. It's something that is in process. You've already asked the question. So is the mayor still here? The mayor's waited so patiently. What's your question, Mayor?
If you would, I'm very,
On tweet.
On tweet, I apologize.
It's okay.
I want to thank you. I'm very supportive of what you're doing. I wanted to add a little bit of local context.
Great.
People may not know, but there are actually two mill valleys. There is the very affluent Mill Valley, and there's the 25% who are below median income that live here. And in Marin County, we have our own neighborhoods which have food deserts, and they are in the canal, and they are in Marin City, and they are in West Marin, and they're in Nevada. So we haven't escaped all of this at all. And I truly support your efforts, and I wish I had a message to tell you all what to do right here in Marin County for the people that have poorer health effects. They have more diabetes, they have higher rates of heart disease, and they have higher rates of tobacco and alcohol use. And the last thing, thank you for indulging me. Southern Marin has the highest level of binge drinking in California, second only to Tuolumne County. There is suffering in Southern Marin County and a craving for drugs and alcohol. And that's what we are dealing with here. So we all need Eco-Buddhism. We all need to focus and be mindful. And there are problems right here in life that we need to work together.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. You have my vote for mayor. Re-elect her. Yes, ma'am.
Is it appropriate tonight for you to look, before we leave, the leadership point of your Buddhism exercise, radical exercises with your students?
Sure, I could do that. Good. But can we end with that? Sure. That'd be great. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the school that you're talking about. Is this through the school system, public school, or is it a charter school? How did you get, such an innovative school started?
Well, there's a school we're starting, which will be a charter school.
It is a charter school.
The school we're starting is a charter school. The school that we currently work in are public schools.
Do you feel that charter schools is the answer? Because I'm a great proponent of public schools. And I'm just feeling that charter schools are eroding public schools systems. Do you feel that, does your community or that the Oakland community feel that charter schools is the only answer to progress and get out of their,
It's a really good question.
environment?
So the crux of a charter school, the reason why folks in Oakland that we're working with are supportive of charter schools is really about control. In public schools, we have less control. So if we think that we've really identified the problem and we think we have really innovative curriculum and we have results, like we have a 98% college going rate in our Step to College classes, right? We know what we're doing is working and we have evidence to show that it is working, right? And as you know, public schools have the Common Core mandate and sort of a whole different mandate that they have to adhere to or they're wrestling with. So I wouldn't say that charter schools are the only solution, but I would say that they have been appropriate and effective. And this goes even in New York, when you look at the Harlem Children's Zone and other places that have really gone to charter schools.
Right. I have several of our families in the school systems, and my feeling is that charter schools do not have, they're not run like a school, they run more as a business, and they get good results because they can handpick the
Cream,
students.
yeah, they
And
cream.
it leaves a whole segment of students that cannot afford to go to.
That's absolutely, that is true in many
And
cases.
it creates even a bigger divide in your own community.
That is true in many cases. I mean, as I said, and I think it's important to note here, you know, we're building a school that doesn't cream. It doesn't take the higher achieving students. We cream the top, right? We want the lowest achieving students. I generally go into schools and I say, I want the students you're struggling the most with. Where are they?
That's admirable.
Right? So I'm just saying that, and so in that case, again, the charter school could be effective. But I'm doing this work in public schools, so it can happen there too. For me, I just want to do the work, and I want to be effective at helping young people. Right? So that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you for your question. Other questions? Oh, yes, sir, you've been patient.
This is less of a question, but an observation and maybe a suggestion. I've grown up here my whole life and kind of felt like there's a community, but it's not very connected and not much talking between each other and action on problems that we all have here. So why don't we start a group between the people that are here and whoever else would like to join? In like the center of town or the library or something, where we talk and discuss problems and solutions.
I think it's a great idea. So there's been a motion made to the floor and about to the mayor or to Angie or to anybody who wants to sort of lead this. It could be a volunteer, right? It could be you, right? But basically that something comes out of these evenings where people stay in communication. And it's an interesting question because that is another reason why we built the tool, right? Because most people, when you have a problem in your community, you only can go by word of mouth to solve the problem, right? But if you use other forms of technology, you can already have this much broader community and you can be connected in ways that you weren't before. So, is anyone interested in this, or should we just tell them it's a no-go?
So, a very perhaps simple, start would be to have everyone like us on Facebook, and we can continue the conversation.
There we go.
At least online as a start.
There we go. Thank you, Angie.
Or we could start like we could just all, if you would like, you could write your name down and maybe like contact me. We could all pull each other together.
I'm open to it. I'm open to it. I know people are scared to give out information generally, so I'm just telling you about a little bit about organizing. Right? You have to build trust, and I don't know if there's enough trust. I think it's a great idea.
I second the motion.
See?
Or just make it known so that if they would like to in the future, once they understand what it's about.
So can we can everybody do what Angie said and like that, and then from that do what you're saying? Can that be the first step? Or are you looking for immediate paper right now?
I just feel like that can be, you can like something and forget about it.
Okay, so what would make you most happy? You want to pass out a piece of paper?
Maybe if we made a group, it doesn't have to be through the library, but it could, where we get together and talk.
But how do you want to contact people? We get the idea. What would you like to leave here with very soon?
If you leave the library, they're open for it. The need once in a while.
Okay, what's your name? Will you be the first person to like Angie? What's your name? Gabriel. Great. Okay. Make it happen, man.
Okay.
I support it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. I'm going to try to pick people who haven't spoken yet. Yes, ma'am. First.
Reservations are very common. The list of people that have
Did you hear that, Gabe? She said people made reservations to come here. So if you could get that list, then that would be a way to already have information about it.
Or they could just, in turn afterwards, people can come to you and say, I'd like to join your group. And I think that's why that's because
I think that's fine, yeah. People go to Gabe if you're interested in this group.
Can you stand up so we can see it?
Gabe? I think it's good. Yes, sir.
So, since you like working in the public schools, I was wondering if you had thought about bringing this presentation to what Cumulative High School, which is the interaction point for the youth at our community between Marin City and Mill Valley.
If invited, I would be happy to entertain that and try to make it happen. Sure. Are you?
No, I'm on the board, but I deal with the school. And my daughter went there, she's graduated, but it's the interaction point.
Sure. That would be great. I'm totally open to that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
It's neat to hear about your mom, and I wonder if that's it's so important to support mothers, particularly single mothers, and open the resources and the wherewithal of grocery stores and things that we're able to help them. They do a lot.
Yep.
Are you looking at that?
Yes, absolutely. All of those things. Yes. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
They say in countries that are underdeveloped or at war or at risk or whatever, the single most important thing you can do is to empower the women and educate the girls.
Absolutely.
And this I've heard over and over again. And I'm kind of wondering, what happened here? Why aren't we doing it right here? If it's
Here in the United States or here in?
Yeah, here in Marin County.
Or in Marin County.
In the Bay Area or in the places that you're talking about.
I see.
What was the
Yeah.
question?
So I think the question is, in developing countries, they often start by educating the girls because girls are so critical to economic development and the growth and survival of the community in developing countries, right? And so the question is, why are we doing it?
Controlling the population, if you educate the women, then you're not having this, they're not having way too many children and on and on. So
It's a-
managing the society.
And her question is, why are we doing that here? You know, yeah, I mean, I think in some pockets we are doing it here, and in some pockets we aren't. And I think that patriarchy is a problem here. You know, so we're not really doing it. That's why I'm voting for Hillary. Right? So we're doing it, but we're not really doing it. We're not really doing it to the degree that we could, but we're doing it, you know, better than others if we want to get into some sort of comparison. But we need to be doing more of it. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead. Yeah. We are in conversation with not Warren Buffett, but with some very wealthy individuals, high net worth individuals. They haven't given us money as of yet, but there's a lot of support for this kind of work and the work that we're doing. And we would welcome any more support if it's something that really aligns with folks' missions and values. So, thank you for asking the question. Yes, sir.
Making some progress with respect to news and, say, documentary.
Yeah, our nonprofit was featured on NBC News with Brian Williams for one of our projects, which is called the Teaching Excellence Network. It's basically a 360-degree feedback tool. You know, generally for those of you who went to school, you know that when was the time where you could give feedback to your teacher? It was basically at the end of the semester, when that wouldn't help you, and it didn't help the teacher, right? So basically we've developed another tool that complements this tool that allows instant anonymous feedback from the 4 main constituencies in a school, which are students, teachers, administrators, and parents. And then it allows the school to, before the school year starts, to get input from those 4 main constituencies so that you can then align your professional development to the needs of the entire community, right? Particularly the students and the teachers. So that tool, we had a very generous grant for that tool, $500,000. And the foundation that supported us for that tool also helped us. The leader of that project, there's 2 who work with me, and our co-founders, Allison Tintiago Cubalas and Jeff Duncan Andrade. And Jeff represented us on NBC News. And we have been featured as individuals in different documentaries, but again, any kind of resources, we're still up and coming. We're sort of the next wave of the Van Joneses, sort of building more Majora Carters or folks who just really care that are working to make a difference. So any kind of support we would appreciate. Yes, sir.
Within your overall work, I'm curious, and I can read your shirt and your joy. I'm curious what you see the role of stoking joy, stoking passion in people as a way to build leadership skills, resiliency. A lot of the work, a lot of the issues and problems are long-term, take a long time to actually do.
Yeah.
It's easy to get run down, burn out, and you have to inspire.
Yeah.
And that's something that you actually really have. I'm a co-founder of a small nonprofit that is surfing. That lifestyle connection with nature, how they try to get to a lot of the same things you're doing.
That's great.
And that's actually one of the key things. There's a lot of ways to do it. Have you?
I think it's a great question, and I love the work that you're doing. We do it in a bunch of different ways. I mean, by being teachers, we are blessed with the opportunity to get to inspire on a regular basis because we're in the classroom, right? The tool that we built, the mapping tool that we showed you, if I asked you, what are the places of peace in a community for a 15-year-old Latino girl? Where would that be? You don't know. What are the places of joy for a 15-year-old African-American male? You don't know, right? But they know, right? And so to visualize that, again, and I don't know if everyone sort of got the power of what we built, right? So when the mayor knows that these are the places of peace for youth in this community, what does that mean for planning? What does that mean for policy? What does that mean for service delivery? It can transform a whole community. It can go from, folks can go from feeling very isolated to very hopeful, right? From very disconnected to very connected, right? And so, we have the opportunity to inspire on a daily basis. And because we're working hand in hand with the young people, they're also getting to, instead of being consumers of technology, they're iterating and they're producers of it, right? And so there's a joy that comes with that, and there's also amazing innovation, right? Because there is genius in the hood, there's genius in the ghetto, there's genius in the barrio, right? There's genius in this community too, and in affluent communities, right? And so it's a very joyful, inspiring work that we're getting to do on a regular basis to pull that out of folks, right? And have them go from, and then the mindfulness piece, having folks go from not being very aware to really aware of both who they are, right, deep within themselves and on spiritual levels, right, and to connecting that to much more larger structural processes and moving them towards feeling like they could be part of a larger movement. It's amazing. So, you know, that's the work that we're into. And I love the surfing. I play around with surfing. I love the whole surfing thing, and I think it would be great to bring that. You're probably already doing it, but to bring that to kids in Oakland and Richmond, you know, that's powerful.
There's a film that was actually done by a friend of mine who was actually screened here at the Mill Surf Film Fest. It's actually called Sunnydale Kids.
Sunnydale Kids.
Yeah, and it's you know what you're talking about. I'm involved in that. We have to talk to boards, see what those.
Linkages are any connections, sure. All right, thank you for the question. More questions? Have I worn you out yet? Y'all are ready to roll out the cots? Ready for blankets? Ready for more wine? More mindfulness. Okay, let's do it. So, you know, we do really simple meditations with young people. And so it would be great to close if everybody could sort of shut their eyes. We would generally ring a bell. And what will happen is we could do two, basically. We could do breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. Okay. So let's do that 3 times. So that's one of the meditations that we do with young people, and they find themselves smiling a lot, no matter what's going on in their day. And then before we eat food, we say the food contemplations. Should I say the food contemplations?
Sure.
So, this food, if we have food, imagine we have food. This food is the gift of the whole universe. The earth, the sky, the rain, and the sun. We thank the people who made this food, especially the farmers, the people at the market, and the cooks. We only put on our plate as much food as we can eat, and we want to chew the food slowly so that we can enjoy it. This food gives us energy to practice being more loving and understanding. We eat this food in order to be healthy, to be happy, and to love each other as a family. So, thank you.
Thank you.